Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest Fireside Chat, How to Choose the Best Financing for Your Small Business, presented by Grasshopper Academy. My name is Mary Mallard. I'm the social media and community specialist here at Grasshopper, and I will be your host for today. So business financing definitely isn't the most fun or glamorous topic, but it is something that's essential that you need to think of when you're starting or growing your business. So what our panelists will cover today: assessing your financing needs, financing options for small businesses, and we will talk about the future of small business financing. Whether you're just starting your business or you're up and running, you'll definitely have some insights here that will help you. Let me take a minute to introduce our panelists. We have Melanie Gordon, the CEO and co-founder of Tap Hunter, Raj Sablock, the president of Manage Engine and Zoho.com, Mike McDermott, co-founder and CEO of FreshBooks, and Mike Rabel, VP of Sales and Partnerships at Funding Circle. If you'd like to learn more about our panelists, all of their bios are located at grasshopper.com/firesidechat. So just a couple more things before we start. We have a couple social media correspondents that will be following along with this chat. You can find them by following the hashtag FRSDchat. We will be leaving 15 minutes at the end of the chat to ask questions, so please ask your questions. You can ask questions either on Twitter by hashtagging FRSDchat, or you can use the chat box that is actually in the webinar screen. If you do tweet, we are having a Twitter giveaway. Two of our sponsors will be giving away, David Worrell will be giving away his book, The Entrepreneur's Guide to Financial Statements. He's from Fuse Partners, and Holly Magister of Exit Promise will be giving away an online business valuation program that's valued at about $300. Our other sponsors that have helped us put on this chat today are listed on the Fireside Chat page. So again, that's grasshopper.com/firesidechat. And at the end of the chat, we will be sending out an email that contains a survey that your feedback will help us make these chats even better in the future, and also will contain the winners of the Twitter giveaway. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. So let's jump right into the questions. The first question that we're going to cover is documentation. So what kind of documentation do you need to assess your financial needs? For instance, business plans, P&L statements, balance sheets, etc.
I'll jump in here and take this one. And so I myself am actually a small business owner, and I do that alongside also working at Funding Circle. And so I have some direct experience with this. I think just taking a step back from getting into the nitty-gritty first, always be organized when applying for capital. Be as organized as possible. And so what I mean by that is think about getting your business tax returns ready to go, your personal tax returns ready to go, and access to your bank statements. At Funding Circle, we require 2 years of business tax returns, 1 year of personal tax returns, and 6 months bank statements. Every lender is different, and so why I say be as organized as possible is there are going to be nuances to each lender you apply for a loan with, and so just make sure you have all that documentation and get it to them quickly in an organized fashion, and that'll ensure your best opportunity to achieving capital.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think for us in the early days, we had a lot of our planning and spreadsheets and forecast and budgeting and trusty old Google Docs, but realized pretty quickly that it was pretty limiting and needed to switch to using Excel. And shortly after, I hired an accounting and bookkeeping firm that whipped us into shape. Being organized definitely, but also realizing when it's time to also, as the business owner or founder, not be the one that's handling all of that day to day, to be able to, outsource to an accountant or a bookkeeper or interim CFO or controller or whatnot to really help you set a proper foundation and the right foundation. It's not that easy to unwind it. Once you get going, it's a lot of work to unwind it. So I'd kind of err on the side of setting it up right the first time.
Definitely.
I guess I just chime in with set your expectations nice and low, because first of all, it is often like a super painful and time-consuming process that results in no additional capital. So depending on the nature of your business, I think it's just good to go in eyes wide open. I sort of, I think all the other counsel is great, is being organized, but perhaps even better, having some professional support to help you, sort of talk the language of the bank or the other party that you're working with. I'm sure we'll get into some of the online lending stuff, which is actually a lot easier in a lot of cases, which is exciting. Yeah.
Great, awesome. So how can you best determine if you need more capital to fund your business? So maybe you've been up and running for a while and you're kind of, wanting to grow. Like, at what point do you sort of realize that, oh, gee, I need more money coming in. I need to get some capital?
I'm happy to jump in here again, and I think Mary, you said it best. It's when you need to grow, and the growing is very situational. Every business grows differently, with people, with products, with assets, with marketing spend, with sales spend, and so and from our perspective, and my perspective as a small business owner, and being at Funding Circle, we always want to lend to businesses that have the growth in mind, and so whether, like I said, that's expanding your business, purchasing a new asset, hiring new people, those are always good reasons that spur the need to borrow money from our perspective.
I think it's really a philosophy, starting at the top with the founders. I think a lot of times business owners and founders might not know initially what the outcome looks like for them, but the sooner you can get clear on what outcome you're looking for as a business owner or a founder, the quicker you will figure out what path or strategy you need to take to funding your business. Raising money from angels or VCs is not the only way to fund your business. The best way to fund your business is through your own customer revenue. But I think it's really important to get honest with yourself and figure out what type of company you're building. Are you okay with, a couple $100,000 or $1 million kind of lifestyle company, and you're never going to take outside money? That's a very different path than taking outside funding and having to really be held to certain growth rates every year. They're both very different paths. And maybe you start one way and head the other direction. That's fine too. But I think getting honest with yourself on what the outcome is for you.
I think those are all great points. I would just add that, really kind of take a hard look at, why you're raising money. I mean, we talked about, Mike talked about growth. That's certainly a driver in terms of being able to support growth. But I would also say that, be very kind of judicious and diligent on when you actually need the money. Because I think one of the things that having money does for you, or not having, I should say, readily available, is it keeps you very disciplined within your business. So if you're focused on knowing that you only have a certain amount of capital and working within that, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think it makes you think deeper about your business and puts you in a better position to actually go out and get loans or financing or whatever you need at the right time. So I think even if capital is readily available, some people say, while it's available, take it. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think you should be very disciplined in your business before you go out and get money.
I think just only because this topic is so important, I'll go with the fourth answer to the question, which I generally do try to avoid doing. Those are all good things. I think it is it's a couple other thoughts. Are you I think often people don't anticipate the downstream effects of taking that capital, right? And so we touched on that, but the expectation is somebody's going to need that money back. It's not like a gift to you, right? So be very clear about that. And what may come of if things don't go well, right? The bank could be taking a chunk of your home, right? There are like I think you have to accept. What I like to tell people to do is like imagine failure, and then accept it, like everything going terribly, terribly wrong, and then see if you still want it. And if you can't live with that downstream scenario, like you probably shouldn't be taking the capital. Yeah, that is yeah. I guess the other thought I'll throw in there is, money does not solve all problems. I'll say personally, we started a business over a decade ago. 2014, we raised $30 million in venture capital. For about a decade before that, I had people knocking on my door all the time, and decided not to bring on the capital for basically all of these reasons. Like, hey, the next problems I needed to solve weren't necessarily solved by capital. Didn't want to be deluded into thinking that it solved all problems because it doesn't. And so, I guess just think about the downside. And if you're raising capital to stay alive, right, you probably have bigger problems. You want to have a repeatable business model and some other things like that.
Awesome. Yeah, all good answers. So along the lines of, knowing when you have funding, are there any government institutions, not-for-profits, or low-cost services that will help a business seek out funding once you've decided that you need it?
Yeah. So I think I can also speak to this as well, just to rattle a few off. I mean, obviously, the SBA exists to provide a very low cost of capital to small business owners, and if you can access a small business loan from the SBA, kind of what Raj was speaking to earlier around sort of does it make sense for your business, often those loans are priced so well and the amortization schedule is so long that they're often very attractive. Some other sort of non-profit lenders that will take on a little more risk if you're just a little bit earlier in your life as a small business owner. Opportunity Fund is one. Another one is Kiva. So they exist to sort of really stimulate the small business economy, especially for sort of early stage businesses. And then those are some of the that just kind of come top of mind.
Okay. So kind of following that a little bit, does it matter how far along a business owner is in their life cycle? And Mike McDermott, you talked about this a little bit, but how, does seasonality affect your need for funding? Does, if you're in business a year versus 10 years, does it really matter? And how would it affect kind of, how a lender would look at you?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is one of the things about this subject that makes it really hard is like every business is kind of in a different context, whether it's its development stage or a different industry, which may have different, sort of seasonality and cash flow needs placed upon it. And so it's actually pretty hard, other than the philosophical answers, to give like really specific, what works for me kinds of things. So I'll just call that out, which makes it challenging for the panelists all here. But if you take this as all kind of philosophy around financing, then you're probably pretty good to go. And then you asked me a second part, which I seem to have forgotten partway through saying all that.
Part of it is, does seasonality affect funding needs if you're more of a seasonal business?
Yeah, and so that's what I was trying to scratch at is seasonality can, like in retail, for example, let's say I've, heard crazy stats, and I'm not a retail guy, but, 90% of your sales are going to happen in like, December or something, depending on what market you're in around the holidays, or November, something, Black Friday, or whatever it is. And you might need to ramp up inventory in anticipation of that, right? And so you might need to access to capital to do that. So sure, seasonality can play a role in your cash flow needs and make you want to raise capital on account of that. I think, but again, it very industry and business specific, and so hard to give a generic one size fits all answer.
I think in terms of how long, I think of it more as the time period in which you've been able to gain traction and also grow it, right? So if you think about the first month to the 6th month, and you should be tracking all of this, even if it's on pen and paper. Hopefully it's in a spreadsheet, but how many customers did you sign up in month 1? Now it's month 5, how many are still with you, right? And what was your growth rate month over month? And so I've seen companies raise great money that had very, very fast traction over a 3 to 6 month period. Or maybe a different company where it might have taken them 12 months or 2 years to get there. So I think in some sense it's less about how long you've been in business. It could be the momentum you're creating and how fast you were able to get to a certain point. But I think, you know, showing a 3 or 6 month track record of your month over month growth, especially when you're in the very early stages, on top of what your customer retention rate is, are probably 2 really important things to wrap your head around when you're first starting out.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just ask a question? Maybe this helps me give better answers. But Mary, do you have a sense of, you know, from the audience, or maybe from questions asking, are we speaking, you know, like, are folks out there maybe can write into Mary and just say like what industry you're in and what stage? Because I feel like there's, you know, venture-backed like technology companies, these kinds of things that are talking to VCs, and then there's, you know, there's more like retail and like very different approaches to financing in each one. And I guess if everyone's of one group, we could probably have a pretty deep conversation. But if we're kind of scattershot, then it's hard.
Yep. Yeah, I was Mike. You just nailed it on the head. I would think I was going to respond to Melanie by saying I totally agree from a lender's perspective, but also addressing sort of the small business owners that may be looking to raise equity capital. It's all about performance history. From an equity investor's perspective, it's like Melanie said. It's, you know, customer acquisition costs. How many customers you've been able to get? What's the revenue like over the past 3 to 12 to 36 months? Then from a lender's perspective, it's if you know this is a seasonal business, like an ice cream shop, you know, there's going to be larger sales numbers in the summer, and so then therefore that's taken into account. And so it's just how do you perform summer over summer? But I think your point is right. Is if we kind of knew where most of, at least where there were some questions or what the audience kind of looked like, we could then get deeper.
I think the other point, though. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think the other point, or maybe the other answer to this question, is also that what's exciting about financing today is there's many options for, you know, the various stages of businesses, whether it be, you know, bootstrap to credit card to business credit cards to micro lenders, all the way on up. So I think there's a lot of options there, and I think in the context of understanding what the specific business is and where they are in their life cycle, there's options that you can kind of map to the appropriate kind of funding vehicle, if you will.
Yeah, so one of the best answers to a lot of this stuff is like, hey, do you have a network of people in your industry that you can speak with to see how they have addressed some of this stuff? Because the answers and the options will probably vary quite a bit. And so as an entrepreneur, it's sometimes hard to get out there and actually meet people. But it can be incredibly helpful to tackle problems like financing and countless other ones in your business.
Great, yeah. In response to, Mike, your question about who's watching, we have gotten some responses. We have some service businesses. We have some brick and mortars, some franchisees. Someone just said they do medical legal counsel or consulting. So we kind of have, it's more less of the traditional tech space, if you will, and more of, you know, our service businesses, brick and mortar, that type of thing, which is typically what our customer base is. So that's sort of who we see, if that helps.
I mean, I think that's very helpful. So we'll see how it plays out in the other questions, but we can use that. Yeah.
Awesome. So moving on a little bit to financing options, and Mike Rabel, you might be able to sort of give us the insight on this right now, but how difficult is the current financial market for small businesses to get loans?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And look, I think to Raj's point earlier, there are definitely a myriad of more options in the market. But just looking at some stats, everyone thinks, since the financial crisis and since the recovery that we've had in certain parts of the United States, that there's more access to capital. But great offers, great sort of priced capital, especially from the banks, they're lending 20% less than they were before the recession. The only people that are getting, or only businesses getting more loans from banks are big businesses. And it's about a 4% increase since the financial crisis. And so what you're seeing is you're seeing actually a decrease of well-priced capital to small business owners. And when I say small business owners, we think of our small business owners as businesses doing $1 million to $10 million in top line revenue with 10 to 30 employees. That's kind of our wheelhouse at Funding Circle. But there are more options, but I think it's very situational to kind of what everyone said and really sort of evaluating what you need, what type of capital is going to be most useful for your business, and then just really educating yourself and taking the time. And I think Melanie said it as well, is like if you don't have the time to dedicate to investing and figuring out and applying for loans, which can be complicated, and that's why Funding Circle exists, because we take that complication out of it with technology and a good customer experience. You need someone to help that process, because it can be confusing, because lenders out there try to speak a bunch of different languages. People have realized there's a gap in the market, so you're seeing like venture-backed companies come to the space and say, we'll give you loans and no recourse, and it's just a percentage of sales. But then when you do the math and you look at what that type of loan actually is and what the annual interest rate will be, it's a lot higher than what they originally pitched. So while there's a lot of different lenders out there, be careful and do your diligence and be thoughtful around what does this loan actually mean to my business, what's the term, and what's the interest rate, and how is that going to affect my profit and loss statement.
All right. Anyone else have anything to contribute to that question? If not, we'll move on. So as far as when you're looking at funding, talking specifically, about loans, how can you best determine whether to get a short-term or a long-term loan? Like, what would you need to look at as far as your business information to decide that?
Mike, they seem like they're
Yeah.
pretty down the center of the plate for you.
Right. Yeah, go for it. I can also chime in.
I mean, honestly, I think you'd probably do a better job than I would on this.
Okay.
I
Sure.
go for it.
So again, this is kind of situational, as everyone's been talking about, and I'll be brief. I don't want to overwhelm. I think that Raj and Melanie and Michael have great things to say, and I want them to speak up more on this. I'm sure everyone's probably sick of hearing from me, but essentially, like the way to get longer term capital, better price capital, is to, one, be organized, and two, it's obviously you think about performance history. So the longer you've been in business, the more free cash flow your business generates, the more likely you are to receive a very low-priced, long-term loan. And so we look for those things at Funding Circle as well. We have a 2-year minimum in business, and we like to see some level of profitability, but it's not necessary. People often, and don't worry often lenders will say you need to be profitable. You don't have to necessarily show profitability on your tax returns, because people often will show negative cash flow for tax purposes, and so we'll dive in there and try to understand the story. And so I think that's part of it as well, as being a small business owner, is really sort of understanding your story and being able to clearly articulate that to the lender. But again, it goes back to operating history and cash generated, and that will be a very good indicator of your affordability of a loan, and then your ability to achieve a very well-priced long loan.
I'll just chime in and say, like, I think, and we've said some of these things, but I think being very specific about the purpose for raising capital is important. And so, for example, like, hey, I want more cash. Well, probably not specific enough. Directionally, great, but is it because you have a season coming up, right? And you need to buy inventory for that season, in which case a shorter term thing is going to be appropriate. And you might need to be prepared to spend a little more on an annual interest rate basis, because you're going to pay it back quickly after you have some sales. Versus, hey, I need to invest capital, the CapEx, the capital expenditure, and like add a new addition building, right? And in that case, it's like, well, you're turning it into real estate, so maybe that's not all bad, and you're going to use it over a period of years. And so I think I guess the purpose and intent of the capital is important. I think I'll just talk about another source of financing, which I think is interesting, and we see a lot at FreshBooks. So we help people with their invoicing and accounting, and we work with a company in this case called Fundbox that does like invoice factoring. So if you're like a medical office or some of the professional services firms, like sometimes you can use your invoices, those that are outstanding, and actually raise like sort of short-term capital based on those funds that are just you haven't collected them yet. So again, I think just be specific about what the purpose is and sort of know your industry and look for appropriate options.
All right, great. So one of the more popular types of funding lately is crowdfunding. So I'm not sure if any of you have had experience with that, but if you could just speak to maybe a little bit about what small businesses should know about crowdfunding, what type of research should they do, should you protect your company assets before doing crowdfunding, like patents or trademarks, etc. Just any sort of information that you might have on that.
Mike, you can do it. Come on, man.
I think I'd like to hear from Raj on this.
Wow.
We're not I'm putting it. I'll just give a brief 50. So at Funding Circle, we're not a crowdfunding lender. We're a marketplace that takes institutional investors and lends their money to small business owners with a term loan that's very similar to a bank product. So, I think that where a lot of early franchisees or small businesses that can't raise venture money or friends and family money, they'll often go to crowdfunding lenders, and it's a good way, especially on the consumer product side, to get momentum behind a product, get it out there. There's platforms that will spray it out to their user base, so it's a good way to sort of get that early traction and create like a viral reaction around it. So it can be useful, but I think, Mary, to your point, is sort of understanding the terms. A lot of these crowdfunding equity lenders will take a bunch of equity, which you may not want to give up, kind of what Melanie was talking to earlier, and they will also require you to often give away free product, which may affect your supply chain. So just really getting into the T's and C's on some of these crowdfunding lenders who are mostly on the equity side these days.
Yeah, I guess my response would be conceptual in that I don't have any direct experience with crowdfunding. I do think it's exciting, and I think it is an option for companies. But things that potentially concern me about it, I think Mike hit on a few. The other thing is looking into, I think you also talked about this, Mary. I mean, what about your patents and your trademarks, or really protecting your IP, I should say. And that is a little bit concerning to me. I think you've got to go in with your eyes wide open. I mean, you're putting your business strategy on the internet, and if you're looking, I mean, I don't really necessarily think you're going to protect all your IP through patents. On the other hand, think twice about putting your whole business strategy out there on the internet. So I would be concerned about that, but it is an option where many of these crowdfunding sites, you don't have to give away equity. You can raise some capital to jumpstart your business, and I think it is a viable option for many startups.
Yeah, go for it, Melanie. Yeah.
I think we've seen crowdfunding work really well for consumer device-focused type companies. So I mentor a handful of startups here in San Diego. One specifically had a consumer device earbud for blocking out noise. It was initially targeted at college students at UCSD, and it was for founders from there. And they were prototyping out their product, bootstrapping it. I think they'd won like a pitch fest a little bit so that they could feed themselves. And a handful of the mentors encouraged them to build their video, get their story out there, and launch on Kickstarter so that they could really validate the product idea that they had. And ultimately they did. And I think that some of the crowdfunding platforms are fantastic for validating a consumer-based type product if that's the idea or direction that you have before you go sink your life savings into an idea. I think it's really great for that.
Great, awesome. So we actually are getting a ton of questions from the audience. So I want to take a few minutes for each of you just to talk quickly about what you see as the future of small business financing and a little bit of advice for maybe, small businesses that are either starting up and maybe overcoming startup costs, or that are maybe a little longer into their business life cycle and starting to, be in the growth portion to get funding. Any advice you might have for them? Melanie, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think that it's never been more exciting to start a business or a company than it is today, whether you're service-based, product, or tech. I think that the software as a service market is helping fuel that. So services like Grasshopper, like FreshBooks, making it just dead simple to start a company. This Tap Hunter is my second company. My first company was more on the agency and services side, and a lot of these tools didn't exist. It was very expensive and cost prohibitive to start up a company. So I just think that it's a really exciting time for small business and entrepreneurs. So yeah.
Raj, why don't you go next?
Sure. So, I would concur with Melanie. It's exciting times, and I think in terms of financing specifically, it's probably. I'll wait to hear what Mike says about it. I think it's never been more exciting, and the options have probably never been more readily available to all size of businesses in whatever stage they are in their life cycle. So all that kind of points to a great opportunity for entrepreneurs right now. I would kind of reiterate that read the fine print, so to speak, and really understand what your goals are before you dive in, because as they say, cash is available. And at the same time, I would say really be judicious about how much money, how much financing you're taking on, because there's the adage of nothing's for free is really true. So I would, my personal philosophy here and our business philosophy has been to limit the amount of debt to an absolute requirement that the business has, or even what you need personally, and if possible, keep those to short term, have good line of sight to how quickly you can pay those off, and I guess on the personal side, what I would say, I would try to limit the amount of exposure you have on your debt. In other words, if you can just isolate it to your business as opposed to collateralizing your debt with personal assets, do that, because if you're going to have problems with your business, that's one thing, but you don't want it to necessarily impact your personal finances. So yeah, that would be kind of my take on business finances.
That's a personal guarantee. I have a very, very strong philosophy, and have been happy to to hold and stick to my guns on this one. And I absolutely have never signed a personal guarantee on any office leases, loans, or anything, especially if you have a mortgage and other assets to protect. I just have not ever been willing to do that. So it's so interesting that you bring that up, because that's actually a really hot button item, and I think people can get themselves into some serious trouble if that was something that they didn't read the fine print on, because I've seen it happen.
So I would say one thing to that, and Melanie, I totally agree. I used to some extent, and so being an entrepreneur myself, I used to refuse to sign personal guarantees on office leases because I'm paying them rent to use it, and if my business goes out of business, why should I guarantee that rent? The other side of it is, even if you're raising equity, you're essentially still guaranteeing as much as you can. Your business is guaranteeing that equity position. And then when you're getting a loan, whether it's from a bank, a small business lender, or the SBA, for a well-priced, great loan, every single lender requires a personal guarantee. And the ones that don't, the APRs are very, very high. And so I would say, it's never comfortable, and that's why you should do the education piece to really understand if you can afford the loan or not. But it's part of receiving well-priced capital. And so just one thing I would say also about sort of the broader market is a couple things. I think Raj hit the nail on the head saying there's a lot of different offerings out there these days for capital. There was an NFIB study done a couple months ago that showed that actually only 25% of small business owners were satisfied with the capital they received. So what that says is there's still a lack of education. People are getting capital and then being unsatisfied with what it does to their business. And so what you're seeing now, or they're unsatisfied with the experience, right? And so what you're seeing is a transformation of how people are getting capital, and Funding Circle's leading the way with technology and a better customer experience, but you're also seeing a wild, wild west to some extent. Go to Google, type in small business loan. You're going to see a million different options for 5 pages, and it's going to be anyone from brokers to lenders to people saying they're someone else, because that's where people go to look for anything these days. And I still go back to my point of really sort of educating your space and borrowing money, whether it's borrowing money from an investor, they take equity in their business, or borrowing money from a bank or a lender like Funding Circle. It's a partnership. And so really understand who this lender is or who the investor is, right? Because there's different terms and conditions with taking equity, with taking a loan. And you want to know that that lender as well is going to be around for a long time. There's nothing worse than taking a loan from a lender that's been around, that's venture-backed, and then all of a sudden you get a notice 16 months into your loan that business is gone. Who's servicing your loan? Who do you make payments to? You want to be borrowing money from investors and also lenders who are around for a long time, who have great track records and are also complying, right? There's a compliance perspective that's coming to the small business lending space, and it's already in the consumer lending space. So the CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, is really diving into consumer lending, which they should, and sort of moving out of the consumer sharks. And there's some small business lending sharks out there that hopefully that are also going to be moved out in the next few years. And so we're really excited at Funding Circle for actually complying in a proactive way with the CFPB, making sure that all the things that we're doing, we're protecting borrowers, we're being mindful about the experience, we're being transparent about everything we say throughout the entire process. And we actually co-authored something called the Borrower Bill of Rights, which a few other lenders and brokers actually signed up to do, which protects borrowers and makes sure they are getting the information in a transparent way. We're all quoting APRs, and we're treating them fairly and not trying to pull the wool over their eyes throughout the process. So that's kind of my broad sweep of what's going on in the industry right now.
All right, Mike McDermott, are you back with us?
I am, but it's still a little flaky, I hate to say. So, yeah.
All right, do you want to take a stab at telling us what you think the future of small business financing looks like for small businesses, entrepreneurs?
I'm quite excited about the future of financing for small business. I think philosophically all these things are true. You need to understand who your partner is. But this used to be something that was run by the banks. And I sort of believe in a world of choice. And with these, things like Funding Circle and there's On Deck Capital, there's a whole bunch of people who now are new options. They're often a little more, I guess they're faster and easier to work with, and they're less. I guess that they're just a little more flexible. It may mean that you're paying more in some cases, but I see that as like having the option to pay more is better than having no option at all. So I see that as positive. And what I believe is over time, thanks to like big data and all this other stuff, like what we're going to have are more offerings that are better fit for everybody. So I think all those things are good. There's going to be people who it'll be easier to get capital for those who can get capital. The number of people who can get capital will be actually fundamentally larger. And then I think there's going to be like better fit products. Like I'll talk about some of our partners who lend really into business like ours based on the same amount of data. I think there will be like dental lending applications, and there'll just be all this specialization in lending, which I think will fundamentally lead to better fit for everybody, because as we've already learned, lending is very specific by industry and everything else, and so I think being able to have more choice and better fit per industry is a good thing.
Great, awesome. All right, well, we have a lot of questions in the chat. We have a lot of questions in email from our participants, so I'm going to jump right into those. The first one, Melanie, kind of speaks to one of the points that you talked about earlier as far as organization. There is a question, are there any online spreadsheet templates that can assist with keeping your records?
Melanie, that's for you.
Think of any. I mean, the templates I've used are for SaaS or software as a service, like business modeling, which there's a lot of great ones out there. So if you're a software as a service company listening to this, feel free to ping me. I'm happy to share all of those links. But I can't think of any others offhand.
Maybe I can speak to this one fairly credibly. FreshBooks accounting software in the cloud. Using a provider like us, where you're running your business in this kind of automated fashion, and then what happens is when it's in the cloud, we can interact with like your bank and feed them data if you choose to help you source funding. So I think that's a big part of the future as accounting software and the systems people use to run their businesses start to go up into the cloud, and then those providers can connect with your bank or other banks to offer you financing. I think is actually, so it's a little different than having a template and filling it out. It's business way, you're going to be set up to more easily and more rapidly get access to capital.
I would add that there's a lot of tools online. Certainly you can search on those, and a little plug for Zoho as well. We've got a number of financial applications and free tools that you can use to model out revenue projections and all sorts of other financial projections. And I'd encourage people to use those tools, because not only getting a point-in-time look at your business, but getting an idea of how your business is going to grow over time is pretty critical as well.
Great, awesome. All right, next question comes from a person who has a fast-growing service business, and they've found themselves with a lot of work, and they have a backlog. They're asking, what performance indicators do you use to help decide to break out of the chicken and the egg, taking money to support the hires to relieve the backlog and grow?
I should totally have this one, having run a service company and FreshBooks actually built for them. I think, again, I would just have a look at how much cash we have. Like, can you sustain a couple months of their salary as they ramp up? And what is the runway? Is it like, do you have contracts that are 6 or 12 months in length, or is it a project that's short term? Because using things like contractors is the middle step. So going from yourself and maybe some full-time employees to contractors on the margin before going to the next full-time employee is a great way to de-risk growing the size of your team, and a good way to think about things.
Yeah, that question reminds me of mastering the art of delegation. And one service when before the tech startup that I run today, I was running a marketing agency. Virtual assistants are a really great way to kind of play around with what you want to delegate or what you want to scale to get done. Even today, I actually use a service called Zirtual for a lot of things that I have on my plate that I might not want to distract my internal team with. And that's a great way to kind of, press play and pause as you need to kind of go up and down with the amount of work that you have.
I think that's a great point, Melanie. To add to that, over my career and even here at Zoho, oftentimes we will utilize contractors, understand how the business is going to grow, and then maybe turn those positions into permanent positions. The other thing I would add to that is, and maybe this is more personal, but personal philosophy, but I also kind of have a idea in mind in terms of financial metrics that I want to adhere to. And so, I think most businesses should do this. If you've got an idea of what your operating margin needs to be, or you want it to be, I wouldn't stray too far away from that. So if you're gonna dilute your business and your profitability, I think very long and hard about doing that. I try to stay as close to the model that I have in my mind when I make those kind of investment decisions.
Awesome. All right, next question. What is needed to get a line of credit established? Which is a super open-ended question, but I think a good one to address.
I'm happy to take a stab at this. I think line of credits are, it depends on which one, right? You can get a line of credit, which is a credit card, essentially, which doesn't require that much. If you want like a very well-priced line of credit with your local bank, you're going to need kind of to go back to the documentation I talked about earlier, which are your business tax returns, your personal tax returns, and at least having 6 months of your most recent bank statements available, ready to go. And they may require, depending on what time of year, interim financials, things like that. And so just like being prepared to apply for a loan with all that documentation is something that for a very well-priced line of credit you should be ready to have.
All right, awesome. Let's see, what do we have next? There's some really long ones here. So this one, I believe, is for Mike Rabel. Could be for Mike McDermott. They didn't specify. What do you think about on-deck and cabbage style of loans?
I'm happy to take a stab at this, Mike, and then you can follow on if you'd like. I mean, I get asked this question a lot, and here's the deal. I never have anything negative to say about MCA lenders, merchant cash advance lenders, such as OnDeck and Cabbage. There's a market. I think this kind of goes back to what Raj and Mike were speaking to. There's a market for them. Merchant cash advance lenders have been around for a long time. They service a certain part of the market, borrowers who need capital very quickly in a few days, borrowers who don't care about the interest rate because they're just going to pay it down anyway, borrowers where that's the only source of capital they can get. And so I'm never going to speak poorly of those lenders. There's a need for them in the market. What we do at Funding Circle is very different because our product is, as about as similar and sometimes often will beat bank pricing. And so when we started Funding Circle, we just saw this gap in the market. We saw there were banks who were barely lending. You had to be a big business around for a long time and extremely profitable, or there were MCA lenders like On Deck and Cabbage. And so we thought that there was this whole market of small business owners who weren't being serviced, who deserved fair pricing, who deserved longer term loans, who deserved transparency and access to capital also quickly in 10 days. And that's what we do at Funding Circle. And so that's kind of how I see it, is there's a need, they're not bad, but we serve as a whole different type of borrower, and that's just sort of like what we talked to earlier. There's a myriad of different lenders, understanding who all the lenders are, and making sure you know what the APR is of those lenders, or what it potentially could be, I think is something that you should think through.
It's a good answer. I think you just got to know, like, even within something like an on deck, like, my understanding is they're going to price what they're lending to you based on you and your business. So someone else may get like a really good deal and you may not, or vice versa. And I don't think that makes on deck good or bad. I think it just means you should, sort of eyes wide open, be aware, and know what the prices are and compare around and figure out whether you can live with it, right? Like 30% annual interest rent for 2 months probably makes a lot of sense. 30% annual interest rate for 2 years probably makes no sense, right? Like what is it you need the capital for, and what kind of deal you're getting, and can you live with it? These are the questions that you need to keep asking yourself.
Great. Okay, next question kind of goes back a little bit to trademarking and patenting. What is, or is there value in intellectual property and a strong business plan when you are going to lenders or VCs or angels and seeking funding?
I can pile in on this one, but this is philosophy, right? So have raised some venture capital, thought about it for a lot of years. Not in an IP-intensive business, but we have some stuff that we consider kind of trade secret, if you will. My 2 cents is this, like patents specifically, and this could be the worst advice you've ever heard, so let me just put it out there. I could be giving you the advice right now that you look back 10 years from now and say, if I can meet one guy and like punch him in the face, it'd be Mike. I actually think patents are often like really dangerous in a lot of industries, and the reason is this: except in extremely rare cases, you've probably patented something that's just not as valuable as you think it is. You've just managed to create documentation around it that seems special, and what that'll happen is you may. Like it'll start to become like this anchor in the way you think about, your business or your product or something that will maybe hold you back from evolving because you feel like it's defensible. But you should have changed that thing that patented then because you've learned something new or whatever it is. And so, especially in technical things like software, but I think like increasing the science and things like that, like they're nice. Like somebody gave you a patent for that thing, but I think of them almost more as defense. Like. And you see actually the big technology companies using patents as defense. Like they buy libraries of patents in case somebody sues them. They have a catalog of patents to go to and use to sue the other company. It's like an arms race. And so for most small companies and things of this nature, opinion mine, patents aren't they're probably not as important as you might think they are. They're like a nice check, but I think you can imbue a great deal of value that's not actually there in them. And they're expensive.
I think that's right. Also being part of a technology company and software in particular, I think Mike's spot on. Most companies that are active in development really are concerned about where patents have gone today. I would concur that patents are important to our company from a defensive perspective, in that we want to have patents, we want to have IP, but we're not going to be a litigious company that is going to go prosecute our patents. I mean, that's just not what we're about. We're about building our business, building more software products and marketing and making money off those, frankly. So, it really does come down to perspective. As I said, patents have gone in a direction that is not all positive, in that we've seen the development of patent trolls that are kind of the bane of companies like FreshBooks, I'm sure, and Zoho, where these are non-operating entities that come after operating companies like ourselves and try to say that you're infringing on some obscure patent. So long story short, I think patents from a defensible standpoint are interesting. I question how and why you'd use them in an offensive kind of strategy.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. Is it a good strategy to hire a funding strategist?
I can try to take a crack at this. So it depends on the size of the business, and then everyone else can chime in, obviously. But I think a lot of times, if you have a VP of finance or a CFO or even a controller, this is something that's in their wheelhouse, and they should be able to handle. I don't think it makes sense to hire a funding strategist or specialist. I can't really think of a business that would need it as a full-time hire. There are really good brokers or referral partners who can be that resource for you, and they can help you identify and take sort of all that work out of your sort of workflow, and really you outsource it to them, and you'll pay a fee for them, and that can be a good option. Sometimes accountants or CPAs can do it as well. But I wouldn't make a full-time hire for that. And if you have someone who controls all your finances, this is something that they could probably lead the way and take it out of your workflow.
Yeah, I think it's, people lend money to people they like as well, and those one-to-one relationships if it's with your local bankers or whatnot, I think it's really important for the founder or business owner to not lean out of that and to be the one who's out there shaking the hands and telling the story of the company. We were approached by a lot of consultants early on here locally saying, we'll help you raise money for your company. It really, telling that story, the vision, where you're headed with your company, that's only best told by the business owner. So even if you have help and support behind the scenes, always make sure that you're the one that's out there in front leading the conversation and telling the story.
Great, awesome. Well, that's just about all the time we have today. For any audience questions that we didn't get to, we will send those over to the panelists, have them take a stab at answers so everyone's question gets answered. Thank you all to our panelists, Melanie, Raj, Mike, and Mike. It was really great. You were really informative today. Just a reminder to our audience, we will be sending out a survey in the next 30 minutes or so that will also contain our announcement of the Twitter giveaway winners. And as soon as we have all of the questions answered and the video together, we will also be posting this on our Fireside Chat page, so it will be there for your viewing pleasure forever. Thank you, everyone, again. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.